This episode of the Leap Forward podcast is brought to you by Bridge LT, leaders in conversational learning and innovation. Through AI role plays, technical simulators, and comprehensive training programs, Bridge LT is revolutionizing the future of corporate and enterprise education.
In this episode of the Leap Forward podcast, Guy Allman, a seasoned automotive industry expert and serial entrepreneur, talks about his career, from founding BTC in 1989 to transforming automotive training and consultancy. He highlights his work on innovations like the vehicle health check system and shares his insights on the importance of practical training in the industry. Currently, Guy advises Bridge, a digital platform using innovative tools to enhance training and reduce staff turnover in the automotive industry. Let's hear what he has to say. I am very excited to be welcoming Guy Allman to this episode of the Leap Forward podcast series of Bridge. Guy, hi.
Hi, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Likewise, you are somewhat of some may call you a veteran, some may call you an insider of this industry. You have a serial entrepreneur, founder of BTC back in 1989 with the goal of creating one of the automotive industry's leading training and consultancy companies, which you did. You fundamentally have changed the landscape, I think, with your work in the auto VHC, the vehicle health check system, and Inquiry Max. A real pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you. Veteran is probably about as good as it's going to get, so I appreciate that description, I think.
So look, before we start talking about where we are today, can you sort of almost catch us up, kind of give us a bit of a kind of plotted career to date?
Okay, I don't want to be boring, so I'll say it as quickly as I can. I'm a horse dealer's son from Staffordshire, so that gave me a great understanding of the motor industry down the line. But I started out in the hotel industry and then moved into capital equipment sales. Don't ask me how, it's a long story. And then I was... I met Ron Sewell socially, and he said, "You have a different approach to sales." And so, at 30, I joined Sewell's International, which at the time was one of the leading automotive training and consulting businesses.
And he himself a bit of a legend.
And I know a lot of a legend, and a super insightful individual. And that was because he appointed me, who'd never sold a car, to teach people how to sell cars. As they say, those that can do and those that can't teach. So I worked with Ron for 2 years, became his sales director, failed in a buyout, and set up BTC, my first company. And then, we had the privilege of working with some of the biggest motor dealer groups over the years, where we installed their sales processes. Well, actually, we did something quite revolutionary. We recognized that people would come on a course, but then not necessarily implement what they've been trained. So I actually stole a model from a company called Half a Car, an American organization, followed up training by taking coaching into the showroom. And that fundamentally resulted in us getting proper measurable performance improvement results. So we sold our training on the basis of how much more money you were going to make, and we could measure it. And that's been one of my guiding principles for the last 30 odd years. Ouch. But so we were busy doing sales process training, and then I realized that service departments were service departments, not sales departments. So they didn't have any of the core disciplines. So we developed sales and after sales, and did some big programs for Ford and Volkswagen and a lot of dealer groups. And it was fascinating that there isn't this culture of sales in the after sales department, and it's still a dark art for, I think, a lot of dealer principals who come from the traditional sales background. But so whilst all that was going on, a guy approached me and said, "Listen, I've got this electronic vehicle health check," and no one was doing electronic vehicle health check 15 years ago plus. So I actually ended up buying that company, and we installed the Auto VHC system in 3,500 dealerships across, I think, 25 international markets. So it's something I was very proud of. We exited that business to Snap-on, which was good news. And at the same time, or before we'd exited, David Boyce, who was one of the founding directors of eGood Manners, came to me and said, how do you fancy doing 50-50 on InquiryMax? And we make a real success of that, because it's a new way of getting people to sell cars, because we're going to use iPads, not pieces of paper. And so we got behind that. And yeah, we managed to get that into a whole bunch of very significant dealer groups and some great manufacturer approvals. And we exited that business to Keyloop just prior to the pandemic, actually. So there you go, 30 years, whoosh, gone. So yeah, and then I got involved with Bridge, which is, to be on the advisory team at Bridge is fascinating, because it was an area I wasn't familiar with, digital learning. And I'm not saying it just because I'm sitting here. I think the impact it can have on the industry could be phenomenal, because we need to fix a bunch of problems that have affected the industry for as long as I've been involved in it, namely high attrition rate of sales and service personnel, which is mainly because if you look at the breakdown of the average sales department, they have, let's say this, the numbers, 5 salespeople in a team, small, but one of the sales team members will have been there for 4 or 5 years. 2 will have been there for 2 to 3 years. But one chair, one seat in the showroom keeps revolving. They come in, they don't get training, and funnily enough, because they've got no experience of sales and vehicle sales, which is a good background for somebody in the auto industry, they don't succeed, and therefore either they get fired or they resign because they can't earn the money that they were promised. So I'm kind of excited that at Bridge we're developing this academy, which means we can get hold of people on the day that they start and guide and mentor them through really fascinating, interactive training materials, like the sort of TikTok style. And we can see what they've absorbed, we can see what they haven't absorbed, we can test them, and we can keep sending them the appropriate material that's going to really, I think, ensure that we go a long way to fixing this. It's astounding that in this day and age, with all the modern management training and techniques that have been around for years and years, we still see 30, 40, even higher percent staff churn. And that's not because managers are bad managers, but they're busy. They're busy doing other things. They're stacking deals. They're making sure the showroom display is okay, that the used cars are fine, etc. And the service managers are making sure that those cars get through the workshop, etc., etc. So, unfortunately, and I'm not pointing fingers, but they simply struggle to give the time to the coaching. And if you don't know what you're doing, the chances are you're not going to do it terribly well. So that's where I see the bridge piece going.
And that sort of serial entrepreneur in you, who's lived and breathed this side of this sector, and the link between kind of how you've sort of driven sales performance and improvement through coaching, and the leap to technology.
Well, the leap to technology is that the processes. So in vehicle health check, I'll start there. That used to be a manual process. So the technician has a check sheet, and he identifies which bits are worn and dangerous, etc. He then hands that, or she hands that, to somebody in the parts department to price up the parts, then somebody else. Then once the parts have been priced up, somebody has to price up the amount of labour. And eventually, if you're lucky, this sort of bad pass the parcel gets communicated to the customer. and there was no means of measuring it. So, I mean, I know it's an old cliche and that's what old trainers do, but, what gets measured gets done. And you couldn't measure this physical process. And now, I mean, you know, I'm, it's sad that still today, because I'm familiar still with the key stats, something like 60% of red work, that's illegal. That's dangerous. Your kids are going to go to school in that car. You're going to pick your wife up or your mother-in-law. Maybe you wouldn't want to do that. But, and this car, its braking distance is seriously impaired. Or the tyres mean, you're going to drive into the back of somebody or worse still drive into somebody. And nobody, forget the humanistic element, is sitting there going, actually, our service department's on target, because actually most service departments are on target. But if you've only done 40% conversion of your red work, how much profit is your business missing? And one of the, well, not odd things, but for the last, ever since I've been involved in the industry, 2%, 3% return on investment is deemed on sales is deemed to be okay performance, and yet hundreds of thousands of pounds disappear out of dealerships through unsold after sales work. It's kind of criminal. And you look at the top performing dealer groups, they're on it. They measure those stats and recognize when they're creating a problem. So for me, that it was one of the things I've always said is it's not what you've done that counts, it's what you've missed that's the opportunity. So looking at the misses in an accurate way is vital to running a business. And it's all too easy because I think, sadly, certainly from an after sales perspective, and I'm not, one of the joys about the motor industry is it's one of the last true meritocracies. You can start as a valeter and finish up running a business or even owning a business.
So many people on this podcast have told me their stories, and they didn't get on at school. They were 16 years old, and someone gave them a first leg on the ladder, and they're leading businesses, global businesses in some cases.
Yeah, so that's a great thing about the industry. I mean, I started in the hotel industry. You can start on the pot wash and end up running a hotel. I love those stories. And the true meritocracies. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people come through to being general managers of dealerships having really just come through the sales channel. And so that if a guy who's come through the sales channel says, how many cars we've sold this week? Well, we sold 50 cars, whatever the number. And how much profit have we made? Okay. Then he'll ask, what's the finance penetration and performance? And then he'll say, how many test drives have we done? And then he'll say, how many people we've spoken to? Because he knows that if we've sold the right number of cars, but only demonstrated to 40% of our customers, there's a whole bunch of cars we could have sold this week that we didn't sell. Right. So there will be a lot of activity to fix that set of numbers for next week. That said, in after sales, how much profit have we made? How does it stack up against budget? He might ask, what's the average invoice value or hours sold per job? But we definitely don't get into the opportunity missed, which is what excited me about the Auto VH. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but Auto VHC enabled and enables dealerships to identify where the opportunity sits, and that's not as a to use that as a stick to beat people with. It's a tool, isn't it? It's a tool to coach people, and so I guess that's why I loved training and seeing the positive results of doing the training and doing the follow-up in dealership. But actually, you also need effective weapons, i.e. tools, like the vehicle health check, like the Inquiry Max product, which ensured that, because all too often salespeople with paper-driven processes never logged the inquiry. They chose to ignore Mr. Cook because he was a bit too smart for me. A lot of people think that. But no, joking apart, it was too easy for salespeople to bury opportunity. And so I like the idea that using technology, you can drive performance. And, I'm kind of proud of the fact that I helped launch eGood Manners in the very early days, back in the early 2000s, when, quite frankly, salespeople weren't trusted with a crayon, let alone a computer, which was the first electronic lead management system. And, when I look at the advances we made using Apple technology to drive good process and better performance, that's the answer to your question in terms of what role does technology play in today's.
And I suppose it also enables you to kind of almost, draw on all of your experience, expertise, and that of the wider kind of network to develop something which is consistent and coherent.
Because I think, actually, it's interesting you should say that, because consistency is key. And I've said, again, for far too long, inconsistent process, inconsistent result. And if you look at probably, I mean, no disrespect to some of the stellar names, but if you look at Arnold Clark, who in my opinion are probably one of the best run from every perspective motor dealer groups in the country, the fact is that Arnold Clark's, one of, I think, its magic pieces of secret sauce, if you like, is the fact that whether it's got a Ford franchise sign over the door, or whether it's got a Chinese new entrant sign over the door, or whatever brand, the clever thing is that Arnold Clark only comes in one flavor. So if you don't want to do the Arnold Clark sales process, it's pretty simple. You don't work there. Whereas, all too often, salespeople are allowed to get into bad habits. And, well, I don't need to do the test drive on this customer. I don't need to log that customer. I don't need to follow them. You can't do that stuff in, Arnold Clark. You take a simple business like McDonald's, for example, where, you like it, loathe it, it doesn't matter. But the consistency of experience in a McDonald's operation is phenomenal. And, I look at even small dealer groups and you think, you don't have a consistency. And how can some dealer groups, like post-COVID, had phenomenal, some of the best results they've ever had in terms of generating profit, because there was a shortage of supply. And yet last year was a disaster for lots of them. Well, what's changed? Mindset? Because I think when you're in the space that says, actually, I can't give you any discount because I can't get another car and I've got loads of customers queuing up behind you. Why don't you have that mindset when Mr. Customer who walks into your showroom today doesn't know that actually there's lots of competition and margins are tough, and they're here to try and buy the best car they can for the budget and so forth. And if the salesperson does his job properly and has the right mindset, actually I can retain good profit. And so mindset and consistency are, for me, huge pillars for any successful business. And, no one can argue that Eddie Hawthorne and his team at Arnold Clark have the most brilliant mindsets, have a really great set of business rules, have a really great set of business principles, and they apply them daily. So for me, there's a lot that can be learned from looking at those really good examples and then applying this process management and consistency that ensures that people succeed. So, technology has a massive role to play, and I'm convinced that we could use it an awful lot better, because the industry is so result focused. I've always said you should focus on the process, not just the result, because the result that's great, but actually the process of getting to that result is the really important bit, and that means we need better trained, better motivated teams on both our service departments and our sales departments.
And we need our training and our learning to be adaptive.
Yeah, and that's, again, one of the issues is that, and it's one of the excitements I have about working with Bridge, is I can give you timely interventions, which are what happens? We recruit 5 new salespeople into our group. Well, that's not enough for us to run our own in-house training. So you could be with me for 2 or 3 months and not actually get any. Well, equally, the chances are that the manufacturer who you might well rely on to deliver that training, well, they could be in the same boat. So as a consequence, there is no proper educational intervention. And it's something that we need to get smarter at, would be my sort of overarching. That's the reason I got involved with Bridge in the first place, because I just think it can do something really, really, really worthwhile. And I know that sounds a bit sort of preachy, but
I think that's good. And I think, you're bringing it to a kind of human level when you talk about that, because, we've spent quite a bit of time talking around performance and profit and process, that, three very, very important kind of P's there, but there's also the people side of things, right? And, back to your sort of chair analogy of the 5 people and so forth. And how do we, the other P, progression, right? How do we do that? Because if we don't progress them, what's going to happen, right?
Well, I think it's kind of, it almost feels so sometimes that it's like the walking the plank. You've got 3 months, that's the plank, and you're either going to succeed or you're going to get eaten by the sharks. But the progression element that's the problem. That's where the coaching and targeted training is desperately required, in my opinion, to ensure, because we've got some great managers in the industry, but we're a very homegrown industry. If you look at the OEM side of the business, OEMs, you're a graduate, you go on a graduate scheme, and you do 2 years in sales and 2 years in after sales, and then you do finance or whatever, and you're on this sort of corporate, well-established and actually proven development route. Whereas in dealer world, all too often, best salesman becomes the manager. Is that necessarily the case? There's a whole bunch of assessment and development that could be done a lot more smartly, academically, that would deliver people a decent training path. I think, sadly, still today, you look at things like appraisal interviewing. It's that time of year again, and it's done by rote, and it's not really meant. Whereas I think I've always felt, when I've run my businesses, that it's my duty to help people progress. In fact, one of the things I quite liked was when I had the training company, somebody would come to me as a sales trainer. I'm not being ageist, but I tried to employ people who weren't going to give them the wisdom of 30 years experience in the industry, but were bright, fresh, at it individuals who could actually do the coaching in dealership, which meant that you were really on it. So being somebody living off past glories didn't work for me. But one of the things I loved was I'd take somebody who'd been a sales manager in a dealership. We then teach them how to train and teach them how to coach. I was proud of the fact that after about 2 or 3 years, I had quite a high staff churn, but I was proud of it. And the reason I was proud of it was, you come to me as a sales manager in a dealership, and actually at the end of 2 or 3 years working with us, somebody would go, "Oh, Guy, I'm really sorry, but I've been offered a general manager's job in one of our client dealerships." And I actually loved that. I really genuinely loved it. And okay, it made running the business hard work, but I think if you really do care, that's what you should be doing.
And I'm sure that had a very positive business development sort of side to it too, right? You're developing talent who appreciates that talent development. They're not going to forget you.
No, unfortunately not. No, I do have that impact on people, but no, I'm very proud of.
Yeah,
I'm very proud of that, because I think, and don't get me wrong, there are loads of people who run dealerships who care massively about their teams, and they've got. I know I was talking about staff turnover earlier, but every week in Automotive Management or Motor Trader or whatever magazines, you see dealerships who are doing their 30-year club. So I think we have moved on from because it used to be a massive hire and fire, tough place to work. I remember working with one particular dealer group that was described in the early days as a punishment-centered bureaucracy. That you can't run a business like that anymore. I guess it's like Premiership footballers. You're not allowed to shout at them, and equally, we have moved on. I don't want to sound too critical, really, because there's some very smart people who are doing really great work, running their teams, developing their people, and great customer service and great retention. I mean, those are it's this small percentage that I go back to, that it's the 20% of the sales team, the 20% of the service department that turns over 3 or 4 times a year, that then results in this 40% staff turnover statistic. So the statistic is terrible, but it's maybe 20%. So if we can fix that 20%, which is definitely fixable because the other members of the team got through. So we've got to get that 20% far more stable, and actually there's a direct correlation between profitability and staff retention and customer satisfaction, because I've never met a salesman yet who said selling a car to a customer the first time is hard work, but selling a car to a customer second time is easy, because they walk through the showroom door and you say, "Hey, Justin, how you doing? How's the family? How's things? Still got that same baseball cap?" All that stuff. And there's well, if you've come back, you're going to buy. It comes back, and it's an interesting mindset piece, because the salesperson knows that if Justin's coming back to buy his second car with his wife and kids, Justin's here to buy. Whereas when the chap or lady walks into the showroom for the first time, there's as much suspicion from the salesperson. Is this person going to waste my time? Is this person a real customer? As much as there is this a salesperson I should trust? Is this a salesperson I should spend my hard-earned cash with? And it's an uneasy alliance on the first meeting. And it's one of the things that I've said forever, that the salespeople, when they sell a car second time around, you've been on holiday. Where have you been on holiday this year? Go back to France again. Yeah, so boot space is really important, because when you take all your camping gear and all the rest of it. What we don't do first time around is, for example, when they appraise their car, A, they don't take the customer with them. B, they don't look for clues. So I'm talking to a complete stranger, but he's got a set of golf clubs in the boot, or there's a child seat, but you're so your grandparents, and how's your grandchild? And that process could be made so much more interactive, friendly, and then useful, because if you carry kids in your car, safety will be really important. Let me talk to you about the safety features on this vehicle and so forth, because that's what they do second time round. Because I know you, I know what's important to you. So I wish people would spend more time, still to this day, in, if you like, investigating the customer, so that I can give them a much better picture of why they should buy the car and buy it from me and buy it today. That's because there's always been this unequal struggle. Because I think you said to me earlier about the customers are smarter today because of the internet.
Are they?
They're probably more informed.
Right.
They probably are more informed, and it's, you can walk into a showroom with Safari on your phone, and I can check out stuff. That's fair enough. But I go back to the days when there was no internet. There you go. Think about that one. But there was no internet. But salespeople were always intimidated by the customer who walked in, who'd read what car from cover to cover and knew why that the Ford Cortina was so much better than the Vauxhall Cavalier. And they had an idea of what their car was worth because they bought a thing called Parker's Guide. And so now I get that information just it has been souped up. The customers still know a lot about what they're looking to buy. They understand what APR is and so forth. And I mean, going back to when I first started, the joke was that the APR was a punter's rate, and now the FCA don't allow you to to do that crummy stuff, which is terrific in my opinion. But unfortunately, salespeople, again, I mean, there's a lot of criticism at the moment about how knowledgeable people are on EV.
Yep.
And that's a challenge, because if you're thinking about buying an electric car, you have done one hell of a lot of research. And don't be surprised if when that customer leaves having not bought, it's because there's a fair chance that the person they're dealing with didn't give them enough confidence in switching from, a conventional vehicle to electric. It's like, how did you expect to win that battle?
And in that situation where you're dealing with someone who's, potentially more knowledgeable than you, than the product that you're allegedly trying to sell, how as a trainer, how as a teacher, how do you kind of overcome that?
Well, that comes back to, we need to do a lot more testing. We have to do a lot more work on why should you buy that car, and let's do some scenarios where, okay, this is a young family and they've got 2 young children. Why should they buy that EV? Or this is a more elderly sort of Guy Allman aged customer who doesn't like newfangled technology. Why should they buy this EV? And what arguments should I have for them? Because I don't think there's enough scenario testing. And that's, again, some of the clever stuff that, I see Bridge being able to deliver. And that has to be ongoing, would be my take on it.
Because you learn more from those simulations or those scenarios than you do from rote style kind of one-way training video type stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's essential that all too often I think, oh, well, there's a manufacturer course on this new EV. Right, okay, fine. Off you go. Right, you come back. You now know about it. I don't need to do any more than that. Well, of course you do. And actually, it's where I think all too often, if I'm being critical of OEM training, it's good at the point of sale, i.e. in the classroom, but where's the follow-up? And that's one of the things that most excites me about how Bridge works, is that whether you're a junior level person, an average person, or a superstar, because actually one of the joys of my life, I haven't done classroom training for a very long time, but if I had 10 delegates in a room, and I haven't spoken to a trainer who's ever argued with me about this point, if I've got 10 delegates, 2 won't want to be there. I don't want to be exposed. I don't want to be shown up. 2 will be superstars. And you just give me as much learning as possible, and I am going to lap it up and try it. So we've got 2 negatives and 2 really big positives. And then the rest sits somewhere in the middle. So the trainer's job is to get the somewhere in the middle across to enthusiastic and move the doubters into, well, I might just give that a go. And but unless that's followed through, the doubters go back to being doubters. And the guys and girls in the middle can actually be swayed either way, because the 2 positive guys, well, they're okay because they're just selling lots of cars and they're really good, and I'm just really pretty average, and I'm going to listen to that guy who's saying what an awful job this is and why we shouldn't do the things that maybe we should do. So that's where reinforcement is such an massively important piece, because actually there are far less training companies around that are doing that in dealer coaching. Actually helps to reinforce the stuff. So that would be the simple answer to your question.
That's fascinating. And going back to you've referenced sales, and you've referenced after sales quite a lot in this conversation, which I find really interesting. As a neutral, as it were. I always think about things as being cyclical and joined up in terms of journey. How important is it that dealers and manufacturers themselves think about sort of the link between the two, and where are we on that scale?
It's an interesting question. I think, I think we've seen, I guess COVID was this feast and famine situation that actually has done the industry a lot of good, because we learned how to sell to customers remotely. And, Kazoo, for all its criticisms, has had a profound impact on the way dealerships go about their electronic marketing, their whole, the way they deal with the internet, and the ease which they're now making it possible for customers to buy cars. So you'd like to think that we have learned an awful lot about, because I think before the Kazoo team came along, no. People won't buy cars without coming into a showroom. People won't buy cars without test drives. People need physical dealerships. And I'm not saying that's been disproven, because it's true that lots of customers, this omni-channel approach to selling cars, which is the most oft repeated phrase today, I think it's always been thus. But we are now far more aware that we have to think more flexibly about our processes and what works and what doesn't work. And I generally, I think the industry's getting better at that. I really do. But I think it's through some very painful experiences that we had through COVID and post-COVID. But yeah, so I'm comfortable that certainly our thinking is far more flexible than it was. And it really, I mean, of course, it needs to be too, because we've got some big changes. This whole agency piece means that, well, have we lost control of new car sales? Well, I guess to some extent we have. And I still think the jury's probably out in terms of whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing. And perhaps not my place to make comments, so I shall be careful and won't. But what it actually does, though, is it screams that used cars, which everybody knows is important, becomes ever more important. And obviously the servicing after-sale side of the business is now paramount. It's off the scale important. And I also think we've got some massive challenges, because we've got agency, which is going to change the landscape. The fact is we don't need as many new car showrooms. The fact is we don't need as many dealers. So the dealers that are left have to be super sharp in terms of their approach to running their businesses and their processes and everything else. And it'll be interesting, the consolidation that's going on. I mean, obviously with Lithia buying Pendragon and Group 1 doing their stuff, and the changing landscape of our dealer group world is enormous. And these are people who are coming from another country. And they're asking questions about how we run our businesses. I mean, we've seen a huge rationalization within a number of businesses. Lookers is just one example. So are we going to see, and it's long been thought, in the old days we had the big Evans Halshaws and the C.D. Bramwells and the Peter Vardys and Reg Vardys, etc. But it's always been, in my opinion, a consolidation where we have like as we do with Arnold Clark, it's a national chain with serious, presence in every part of the country. And so what impact does that have on the smaller family-owned businesses? It's an interesting question. And so I think if we're looking into the crystal ball that's the future, what does agency really mean? What does rationalization mean? Actually, I'm always impressed with the work that Dale Wyatt of Suzuki is doing with his network, because he actually very strongly came out and said, if manufacturers were meant to retail their product, then actually I ought to be sacked and Dash Gupta ought to take over from me. And kind of, I find that a hard thing to argue against. Suzuki are dedicated to their dealer network, and they work hand in glove with them. They're not an onerous brand in many respects, in terms of whether it's corporate ID and all the other stuff. And they want their dealers to succeed, and they want their dealers to be part of a community. So actually, maybe there's space for smaller family-owned businesses to work with maybe the more niche brands delivering this sort of community retail experience that actually I think is important, whether you're in, as we are in London today, or whether we're in Tunbridge Wells or whatever part of the country, because I still think buying a car should be a good experience, not a torture that people are forced to go through. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the landscape unfurls itself in over the next 2-3 years. I mean, it's going to, because we've got a lot to do with electrification.
I was going to ask you about EV, because you've mentioned a number of really interesting kind of factors which are impacting us. What about electrification? What is the impact of that, do you think?
Well, it's going to put pressure on the after-sales departments, that's for sure, because, you know, there's less stuff to fix, but the stuff to fix is very expensive. So I think there's probably going to be a balance. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunate. I think it's as inevitable as the tide coming in. You know, anybody who's trying to say it won't work and our infrastructure is not there, and we'll look back in 10 years' time and go, can't believe we were saying all that about infrastructure and stuff. Because it was like, you know, I remember mobile phones. I mean, mobile phones are something that, you know, I had a brick in a leather case, and you can use your phone in your car. Yeah, you can use your phone in the car and stuff. And like, you know, the internet, and it's now at everybody's fingertips on their phones. And so whichever way you look at it, there's no way that you can say it's not going to happen. And it's just whether alternative fuel, and the debate rages, will have an impact. But for sure, fossil fuels as we know them today, they're as dead as the coal mines.
And I think irrespective of what that fuel is and what form of propulsion these vehicle systems take, right, one thing that we know is that we are seeing an inevitable rise of technology, you know, across the piece, right? And I think that's a really interesting kind of question for me, particularly when you talk about it from your perspective, because, you know, we've talked about sales, and we've talked about sort of after sale, but you know, that inevitable rise of technology, the point that you were talking about, sort of the customer coming in sometimes more informed than the salesperson. Tell me about that kind of relationship between tech and sales and tech. You know, like, we've got technical advisors, but they're almost, you know, becoming trusted authorities because they're the ones that hold the keys, right? They know how these things work, right? When do they become salespeople, and when do salespeople become techs? And then second point to that is, you've come from this world of performance and sales. How do you teach those tech folks how to deliver on the electrification challenge?
Well, the answer to that is, unfortunately, I've seen I'm plugging Bridge again, but forgive me. In as much as I've seen lots of technical training that's as dull as dishwater. It's not interactive. It doesn't engage. And, you know, don't be surprised that somebody does a box ticking exercise to get through the course. And don't be surprised that they don't retain it and don't do anything with it. Whereas if you can do engaging, interactive, fun, informative, useful learning, then actually you've got more than half a chance of getting people to be able to give the EV customer or whatever a better, more knowledgeable, more trustworthy, more useful experience. And whether that's in the service department or on the sales department, because don't forget, I mean, lots of service advisors haven't necessarily come through I've been a technician, and as part of my journey, I'm now going to go on service reception to then be a workshop controller or whatever it happens to be. You know, there's a lot of service advisors who come from a non-technical background who actually do shy away from answering questions and giving the customer the confidence that they need to maybe get. I mean, it's probably evidenced mostly by the unsold red work. The unsold red work at 60%, I think in a lot of instances is down to the fact that the person who's saying, Mr. Customer, your car's been it's on the ramp, and we've identified this and it really needs doing. Do you want to go ahead? And they go, no. And, well, hang on a minute. Have you really thought this one through? You know, I'm not trying to push you, but just thinking about you and your wife's family. and safety and all the rest of it. But because they're not on firm ground, and they don't realise that 1.6 mil worn tyre equals this reduction in braking distance or whatever, they then can't be convincing, giving them the reasons why they should buy the red one. So it's not just a sales department issue, it's across the piece.
It's the opposite in a sense, isn't it? It's enabling and empowering a tech to be able to talk in a kind of more kind of human way, right, and make it relatable.
Well, yeah, I mean, but equally, just giving them the knowledge and tools that they require to be convincing with the customer, and convincing, I mean that in the most positive sense of the word, which is why, again, you look at a lot of technical training, it's one-dimensional. And it isn't engaging, and that's why, we need to look at digital learning in a much more creative way, which I think is the USP that sits around Bridge in the way that they get people on board. And so, if that answers your question, I think that's how we deal with shifting an unequal balance, if you like. So, yeah, I mean, I'm excited because I think these things can be, I used to do classroom training. I used to send people out into dealerships and so forth. And there's nothing wrong with that. It still has its place. It's a bit omni-channel, an omni-channel approach to retailing. Actually, omni-channel approach to training.
I love that.
I do too. I can't believe I came up with something as good as as good as that. But actually, exactly that. An omni-channel approach to training people that says we have a proper mixture of classroom, coaching, and digital could have a massive impact moving forward, and actually has to have, because, I mean, it's a cliche, but I'm a trainer, so I've been doing cliches 30 years. If we always do what we've always done, we're always going to get what we've always got. And I think there's a big third dimension that could have a massive, massive impact on dealer profitability, on outcomes, on customer satisfaction, customer retention, customer journey, the whole 9 yards. So, future, exciting.
I'm going to end it there, but I'm going to ask you a couple more questions because that was a phenomenal way to end. I'm just going to keep riffing with you if you're okay for a couple more minutes, because this is a great conversation. So we talked quite a lot about sort of progression, and I think that sort of that's come out really clear, and that consistency. Tell me a little bit about sort of the day zero. How do we get the right people in the first place?
Well, so I pioneered with BTC, group assessment recruitment, which actually, unashamedly, I nicked from Mars, not the planet, the confectionery, business. Mars wouldn't employ somebody on the basis of an interview, and they believed in testing. And I'm a massive believer in testing. If you couldn't get a job in the factory as a cleaner if you couldn't use a mop. So guess what? We're going to get you to mop the floor as part of your recruitment process. And I'm a massive believer that, the joy with the industry is we don't need people who sold cars elsewhere, because they could well be coming with loads of previous baggage.
Yeah.
And we didn't do it that way, and etc. And you take the really smart organizations, they're very good. They believe in growing their own, which is important. So we take you with no previous experience, no previous preconceptions, and we mold you into our way of doing things, which is right. But before we get you into that square, I think we should be so much more. If technical ability is important, then I need to get you on a laptop or whatever. If using the phone properly phone skills are important, then let's role play a phone call. If having the right attitude and approach is important, which of course it is, then let's do some proper psychometric testing. And in my previous life, we did thousands and thousands of psychometric tests. And do you know, the ironic thing is, I don't think I've ever seen a bad one. I mean, one that's wrong, except if somebody was going, I don't believe in this stuff, and I'm just going to doggedly not answer the question as I see it, but just that's about the only time you get a flat line. So I'd like to see far more testing, both intellectually, mentally, skills being applied to that process. And if you have, as we used to do, you take 15 candidates, and through the course of a day, you say, we are going to test you and we're going to put you through this series of exercises. And actually, you're not all going to make it through to the end. But actually, that doesn't mean to say you're a failure. It just means we're not right for one another. So we won't waste your time. Because actually, at the end of today, you're going to know you've got a job. Mm-hmm. So we won't keep you waiting. We won't let you send hundreds of applications that don't get answered. We will deal with you in a very professional and empathetic way. I mean, we won't ask you to do a test without giving you a decent briefing in terms of the things that we might be looking for and so forth. So I think rather than doing a 2-hour interview, giving somebody 8 hours to be tested in the right environment with your competition, if you like, who are up for this job. I've seen it many times. We really did have using that approach, we had a significant impact in terms of the failure rate of people. Because if you're recruiting on the basis of you can steam up a mirror and your CV looks okay and your breath didn't smell or whatever, don't be surprised that you have a high attrition rate. Whereas I think, people definitely felt if they've gone through this testing process, actually this company, they've got some pretty high standards and it's not easy to get in there. It's quite a smart club to get into. So once I've gone through that and been offered a job, well, I've really achieved something. I can't think of a better way to start on day zero, knowing that there's been a quality assurance process that says I'm actually in quite a smart group of people here.
And thinking about applying the use of technology in that is really interesting to me in terms of back to our point around, adaptive, kind of personalized, there isn't a kind of, it's not a kind of pass fail. It's more like, Guy, you're not right for this role, but you show, characteristics, skills, competencies for this role, right? So that is something that we can do at scale as well.
Oh, well, that was one of the things. Amazing, we'd have people apply for a role in sales, but actually by the end of the day, you sort of kind of figured out, okay, sales might not be right for you now, but you'd make a great customer service advisor.
Yeah.
And
love it.
So actually, maybe you're a bit introverted, but actually we've got a vacancy in admin, and you were really great on the PC. So you can have some very good outcomes, because I think there's nothing worse than somebody going for an interview, them being told, well, we'll get back to you, and then of course they don't. So I think we could definitely be smarter, and the tech, things like the psychometric testing. I think, why don't we do that more often?
And we can that's the thing, we know the technology side of it's easy, right? And the impact's huge, so we should talk more about that. I think that's interesting. On the other side, I suppose, you talked about the fact that you were training people up inside your businesses, and they were then going on and saying thank you very much, and becoming general managers and so forth. Tell me a little bit about how you teach leadership and management.
Well, one of the things is that hateful phrase "born leader," and leadership. As we've seen evidenced in football, there's quiet leaders, and there's then there's Roy Keane's and so forth and so on. And the blueprint is interesting, because in all sorts of walks of life and industries, leaders do come in lots and lots and lots of shapes and sizes. But one of the things I've always thought important is if an essential quality of leadership is motivation, and effective motivation. You don't motivate people by shouting at them. You don't motivate people by telling them they're marvelous every second of the day either. I think you motivate people by giving them outcomes for them and their family. I don't just mean the job. So in other words, the industry pays people very well. And mostly there's bonuses for performance, whether that's in commission from vehicle sales or achieving profit targets and so forth. So I'm a massive believer in giving people a sense of purpose that says, actually, where do you want to be in 5 years' time? Okay, how are we going to get you there? So we can't do 5 years, but what we can figure out is that by the end of this year, if I don't know, there's a place in the world. Sorry, I'm digressing, but it was a really interesting. I saw an American trainer years ago at the NADA show, and he said, "I'm going to give you two great questions for when you're recruiting a new salesperson." And he said, "So, the first question is, how much do you want to earn this year?" So the answer is $50,000. Okay. How much do you need to live? $30,000. Okay, great. What would you do with the $20,000? And if the person can't answer, you've got a $30,000 salesperson, not a $50,000 salesperson. The point I'm really getting to is that I think it's terribly important that people get up, come into work, and have a purpose for themselves. So, in other words, I've always said to people, is there a place in the world that you've ever wanted to go to? Well, yeah. So what's stopping you?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, a plan. You haven't got one. So I think it's incumbent upon every leader and manager to really understand why that person's coming to work. And I'm not coming to work for £100,000 or whatever the number is. I'm coming to work because I want to do something with that. And if you ever see somebody that's pretty flat in terms of performance, average maybe is the word, I actually genuinely believe that's because they haven't got a purpose. And that's where the management fundamentally letting down the people that work with them. And because, I know from personal experience, I mean, I started with nothing, have created businesses, but I've absolutely had a set of business goals, but my personal goals drove me much harder than my business goals. Because let's face it, I mean, it's too easy to miss a target or a budget in business, but it's not very optional when it's your life. Sorry.
Absolutely. That's a really interesting point, because those two worlds are in some way intrinsically linked, right? You spend so much of your time at work. How far do you think we can go to support that sort of link back to personal and business goal?
I don't think it's optional. I actually think if you care about, I won't care about my company if my company doesn't care about me. And I know that's trite, but the reality of the matter is, if you've got a team of people, I used to play sport and stuff, and the moment you stop caring about winning, the moment you stop caring about your teammates, if we want to get the best out of our business, we get the best out of our people, and to get the best out of our people, we've got to understand them and give their work a purpose. Because, as you say, we spend too much time at work.
And someone thinking about entering this industry, one piece of advice you'd give them?
Just don't get stuck in the mire. The cynicism that is, you look at the cynics are painful and they drag you down. So find the ups, because the great thing about the motor industry is, as we were saying at the very beginning of this discussion, you can be whatever you want when you enter the motor industry, and it's down to you. And find me a better industry than that.
Guy Allman, thank you for joining Bridge on this Leap Forward podcast. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Privilege. Thank you very much.